next up is Ivan, who's gonna talk about how to stop being a Rails developer, or something like that. So please give a round of applause for him.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ivan. I'm actually from Russia, but I live in Serbia for a year. And in Serbia, we don't have two active Ruby communities. And and my visa runs out, so I decided. And I found that there were two meetups, one in Zagreb and another one in Ljubljana, two Ruby meetups. So I decided it is a good cause to be here. So. Since this is a Ruby meetup, I decided I prepared two talks. One is about Vim and another about CoffeeScript. Which one do you prefer?
Which one is first?
About Vim. And another about CoffeeScript.
Vim.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'm kidding. So, if you read the notes about today. My talk on the meetup.com, it was something about how to prepare a Ruby developer in 2 months. But this is a short talk without any slides, and I have another one, and the second one, this one short is probably not very useful, but more interesting. And I have one which is probably gonna be useful for somebody. So, how to stop being Rails developer? This is actually my story, how I stopped to be a Rails developer. And before we start talking about it, we should understand what is wrong actually with Rails. And I'm not gonna talk too much about it. I just tell you one short story. I started to notice one pattern in my applications and in the applications of my friends and colleagues. So let's imagine you start to work on a new Rails application, and this shiny Ruby represents your application, and the Rails represent the timeline, the process of development. So at the beginning, it levitates and it can go forward very fast. And your customer asks you to add some features, and you start using some gems, and everything starts to look even more shiny and goes forward even more smoothly, and customer satisfied and excited, and so he asks to add more, and you add more, but some of the stuff, some of the functionality and gems already not fit that good, and you start using nails and glue to stick everything together. And at some point, if you keep adding the stuff, you can find yourself in this situation, and this is what happens with many Rails developers. So that you added so much stuff that every step forward becomes very, very painful, because you add something and something breaks into other places, and you're running around and fixing it all the time. So there is kind of a formula that the amount of mess in your application is proportional to application size and divided by your ability to manage complexity. And at this point, I realized that Rails doesn't provide too many things to manage the complexity. So I decided to improve my skills of complexity management. And I started to Google, and I found solid principles, design patterns, different refactoring techniques, and so on and so on. But I got a problem. Even when I read the books and articles and watched videos from conferences, I was totally agree with authors. I was excited by their beautiful code, but I wasn't sure how to apply all the techniques they are talking about to my code. So it was not obvious for me. But luckily, one day, the client came to me, and he had a team, and they had an application, and the team pushed forward the application very hard, and the client pushed them hard, but they stuck. So everything was very slow. And yeah, the problem, current team stuck. And the project was a monolithic Rails application. Rails is a web framework written in Groovy and inspired by Rails. And there was a MySQL database of 70 tables. And client was kind of smart, so he came up with a solution, and he decided to split front-end and back-end, and he already had a front-end team. And he wanted me to implement back-end on Rails, to re-implement all the functionality for them. But there were two limitations. The first one is I had to keep database structure because old application and the new one had to run in parallel in the same time. And for some reason he decided not to show me the existing code and even whole application. He decided to give me features one by one. So he thought by doing so I will not re-implement all the mess they already had. Okay, anyway, so let's see the first feature. And the first feature was pretty simple, users registration. And as I started to read the documentation for the feature, I realized that we have three different types of user, and they have different registration forms. They have different validation rules and different sets of forms, but all the information was stored in the single users table. Well, so and here the DHH comes and tells us, well, I have even two features which you can use to kind of solve this problem. First one is single table inheritance, and the second one is conditional validations. But I couldn't use STI because I was not able to modify the database. And as for conditional validations, I was not very sure I want to use them because it was kind of the very first step of the application, and I knew that it's gonna be complex, and conditional validations add too many complexity at the very beginning, and I didn't want it to do that. So, and if you think a little bit about it, so you might understand that both these Rails solutions are kind of workarounds, not a real solution. And the underlying problem is a bit deeper. So as I mentioned, I've read some books and articles and stuff like this, and remember that funny thing in a Word, in the Microsoft Word, which popped up and was trying to help you with some advices. So this guy popped into my mind, and this is Uncle Bob, and he reminded me, hey man, you kind of read about my single responsibility principle, and probably it can be applied here. So I decided to think about this situation, and I realized that my user model is going to know how one kind of form is going to be validated, how org user form is going to be validated, how guest user form is validated, and how to store the data. This is actually what Active Record provides us. So it looks like therefore I'm going to put 4 different responsibilities into a single model. And another guy pops out and reminds us about the pattern called form object, which is kind of for solving these kind of situations. And let's cook the simplest possible form object. Let's take a Ruby class and just add active model validations there and our validations, so that our class start to behave like a regular active record object for the Rails forms. And we can replace author accessor and initializer with a virtus it's a bit more convenient when you have more fields. So this is how bigger form object can look like. And this is how we can use it in a controller. So we pass the parameters to our form object. We check, we ask it if it's valid. And if it's valid, we just put the hash of this form object, which is basically the same params hash, or maybe a little bit modified. We just pass it to the user, and Active Record stores for us. So form object helped us to have 4 simple objects instead of 1 complex. So I was kind of glad I had this idea. And here comes the second feature, bonus code redeem. It's kind of simple. User comes with some bonus code and it shows it to the system, and system checks how much it should put on his account. And I recently started an internship for junior Ruby developers, and most of them, when I give them a similar task, they write the codes like this. So they just write in a procedural style. They just put one big action in the controller, and they check if bonus code exists, if it's not already used, and if something goes wrong, they just return a JSON representing error message. And if everything is okay, then some kind of business logic is called. So we mark bonus code as used and increase the balance, and so on and so on. So yeah, those are prepared pictures. So anyway, usually there are a few interns who are a bit smarter and they don't like long methods, and they know that if we will have a long method, we probably should split it. And if Uncle Bob pops into their minds, so they might notice that there are 2 responsibilities here. First one is controller responsibility to take the params and to send the requests or responses. And another one is the business logic. So the business logic is in blue here. And since the developer realized this, he decides to extract it to a method. Half of a logic to extract in a method. So, and usually they do just a private method in a controller, and that's it. But the smartest one, they remember that we should have skinny controllers and fat models. So they are moving, they extracting method to a model, but then they need to decide where to put this method, to bonus code model or to user model. And there is no right answer here, because these 2 guys remind us that there is a thing called service object. Somebody called them use cases or interactors. And this is a kind of a classes which is which goal is to help you to manage business logic like this. So, and let's try to cook the service object. Let's put everything, all our method into simple Ruby class, and we call it redeem bonus code. And right now, if we take a look, we can see that that our Ruby class doesn't know anything about rendering, but we have rendering all the way around. So let's just replace the rendering with custom exceptions raising and beautify it a little bit. So since we did it, it looks fine. There should be no syntax errors here. Let's try to use it in the controllers. Since we moved the stuff into the class, let's instantiate it and call the method run with parameters. And since we know that it is going to raise exceptions in some situations, and we know what kind of exceptions it is going to return, we can write a logic which will send corresponding error message to the client in different situations. If everything goes okay, it just returns a value at the end. So service objects are helping us to separate business logic from controller responsibility. And let's think so I kind of found two convenient ways to organize the code to prevent the mess in my application, but there was another thing which made me not very happy. The database. I can tell you two things about the database. The first one, of course, it was not following Rails conventions. And the second one, it was normalized. And it was that normalized that there was a separate table for statuses, and it had 3 rows in it, and a separate table for genders, and it had 2 rows in it. And in user, I had them represented not as strings, but as IDs. And to store the original profile image and a resized profile image, there were 5 tables, 5 additional tables. So I had to write code like this to get original and resized URLs, image URLs. So, and in Rails, in this situation, you are forced to have a model for every table in the database. So it's just a convention. So I had a few models like this, but since you write it, you wrote it, it's kind of okay, but I realized that the way the information in database was structured, that way forces me to write my business logic code in a concrete way. And I was not happy about that way because I had to write code like this, user.profile.imageVariance and stuff like this, and all those association chain. So, and there's another guy, his name is Eric Evans, and he's author of a book about domain-driven design. And if we try to identify domain-specific objects in our story, we quickly realize that the objects like image and image variant and image settings, they kind of have no sense in terms of domain-specific, of domain and business logic, because I don't care how the information is stored. I just want 2 strings in my profile object, which I'm going to use to show the profile image. And luckily, humanity invented a pattern for this situation as well. And the pattern is called repository. And repository is the kind of a classes which responsibility is to care about how your data is stored in the database. So, and it came up with an idea of entities, and entities are your plain Ruby objects. These are your actual models, which don't know anything about the persistence. So repository class can do 2 things. It can whether store your entity in the database or return you an entity by some query, by some ID or some other special query. And again, entity example, simple Ruby class with a virtus for convenience. And when it comes to repository, it's a bit, if you take a look at this code, you might notice that now we don't have active record magic here. I was using SQL here, and I had to write the queries by myself. So you see table select, some columns and the condition, and then the second part of the method, when I make an additional query to get the roles, so they could be represented as an attribute in my role. And a little bit more complex query, I do two joins here to get those two things, profile status and the gender, as a strings, not as IDs in my entity object. So profile is a Ruby object, not an active record object here. So there is no active record anymore in this story. And to persist the profile, it's you can see that now when I have two strings, I first need to do two additional queries to get IDs of those strings. And since I get them, I can form a hash to my insert or update query. And then you can see that I had to care about updated that and created that manually. So what this approach gives us? So it gave us the very important thing, that the database structure was not controlling the way we write business logic code. And the sad thing that there is no active record magic anymore, or somebody can say that it is a good thing, but since there is no active record magic, we had to write lots of low-level code, but it's kind of obvious code. And since you wrote it, you have control over it, not Rails framework developers. So let's take a look at the whole picture. Before that, we had a single controller method, and it handled all the stuff. And these are structural elements I used to structure my code. So the first block is a form object, which returns something to the use case. And use case can work with one or more repositories and knows how to do it. And it raises exceptions or returns a value, and the controller knows how to handle exceptions or how to return the value to the client. So since I applied these three techniques, I realized that I was not depending on Rails anymore. And Rails in my situation become just a tool, not a core of my application. Because when you develop an irregular Rails application with the active record in its core, you're gonna have problems, because the core should be stable. It shouldn't be changing too often. And when you have an active record in the middle of your application, you had to change them because of the customer requirements, and you had to change business logic all the time. So let's summarize the stuff. So form object helps us to uncouple this Rails convention that we had to have for one model and one form. And service object helps us to separate business logic from controller's responsibility. And the repository helps us to uncouple this convention that single model should be stored in a single table. So let's return to the topic of my talk: how to stop being Rails developer. I think being Rails developer means that you're following Rails way all the time, and you don't care what kind of a problem you have, and you're not trying to think about another solutions. So how to stop being Rails developer? Don't miss the point where Rails becomes not enough. So since your application grows in the size, it's very easy to miss that point. And you should learn and explore different complexity management methods by yourself. And you should proactively look for opportunities to apply them in your work. And of course, there are existing tools which are already implementing those patterns. But if you use somebody's solution blindly, it's the same. I think it's the same as you would be just using a Rails way, because if you're not understanding the concept, it's kind of you're gonna be writing bad code anyway. So here are some of the existing tools which you could find useful, which are already. Interactor Gem is an implementation of a service objects layer, and Ruby Object Mapper probably is everything I was talking about probably can be replaced with single ROM library. So, and the Lotus is the framework which has all the ideas I was talking about at its core. So, and Reform and Trailblazer, and there's another thing called Active Type. You can take a look at them as well. So, here's my website, and here's my Twitter, and I had to say thank you for all these smart guys. None of them fit in this kind of small screen, but anyway. And I can recommend you this blog. I found it very useful because the author of this blog represented all the ideas of those smart guys, but applied to the Ruby world, to the Rails world. And I recently started my own blog about problems like this, and I will be happy if you find something useful there. So that is the end of my first talk, and if you have any questions, please ask. Okay. Yeah.
If you suggest us to do not concentrate on Rails or support system in our application, why we should use Rails, not Sinatra or any other?
Because, because you had to do, if you take Sinatra, you had to do a lot of manual work, and Rails lets you to not to do it. And sometimes it's if you start with plain Sinatra, you'll spend big amount of time doing very obvious stuff. And Rails lets you to have your things up and running, I don't know, in an hours or in a days. So it makes sense to keep using Rails, and most of the customers actually ask us to use Rails these days, and we are had to use it. But at some point, we should I don't know, use awareness or stuff like this to not to miss that point when Rails starts to hurt too much. So that's the idea.
So it's subjective when this point will be used. So it depends on you when you find this point.
Well, of course. Any other questions? Huh? Oh, thank you.
Once you move away from active level, which I think is one of the biggest pains on Rails, do you miss out like a lot of the gems that are kind of monkey patching, active record? Do you use that for benefit of some of those? Because you have your own just play on Ruby objects. Because it feels like a lot of the gems are all looking into active record.
Sorry, I hear you not very good.
Sorry, I feel so slightly strong accent.
Okay.
I guess like example, like you know, like the taggable jet is kind of I guess that's meant where it expects like a graphical, and as you move to like usually playing moving. So if you can get into it, you kind of lose them, but you can't use those kind of jumps.
Okay. So the idea is that. So yeah, of course, if you're gonna switch to repositories or something like this, of course you are losing all these games which do work only with active record. But the guys like Sonic who does ROM and Luca who does Lotus. They find this approach harmful because we kind of have a single instrument in the whole ecosystem, which is Rails, and I don't know, 70% of the gems their only purpose of existence is to support the Rails, and it shouldn't be so. So this is the idea. Okay. Well, I think it's the main problem. As I said, the main problem that it is in the core of your application.
Yeah, but it's not, so you can just throw out extra record and use something.
No, I don't mean that you can do it, but it's about idea, about approach. You can use the Mongolia to stuff like this in the same way, so it's gonna be the core of your application.
Yeah, but it's active record that dictates this kind of approach, like one model or one form.
Yeah. So, am I allowed to give another talk?
No, I don't think so. It's been a while.
Is this a problem?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, yeah, we're ending.
That's sad.
Why?
Because it's pretty short and I'm sure everybody will be excited.
It's been an hour and a half. Oh,
Well, let's just ask them.
do you want to hear another talk?
It can be very short. It can be 5 minutes. If you don't like it, we can just turn everything off and go out. And I don't have slides for it.
Okay.
So it's a very short story, but this story I was talking about is more than a year old, and this story is very, very up to date. So a month ago, I decided to find a few interns for myself. So I would teach them how to write code, and they're gonna implement some of my ideas. They're gonna write a few prototypes for me. So I'm gonna be a startupper. So I wrote a blog post about it, and accidentally, since I posted, I got 10 applications instead of 4, and in the first 2 days. And in a week, I had 25 applications, and then I decided, okay, it's kind of a good. I can now choose the best interns and kind of. So I came up with the test task, which partially those tasks are they are very similar to what I was talking about in the previous talk, and the task is separated into 4 parts. And first one is very simple. You just have to implement registration and ability to create products and the list of products, and that's it. Then another feature is kind of changing everything in a very interesting way, and then another time and another one. So at the end of 4 tasks, they show me all the mess they are possible to write. They can write. So and then we have a group code review, and then okay, that was my idea. So and it worked well, but when I was inventing these tasks, at the end of my work I had already 40 applications to internship. So then I decided that maybe I can do something so that everybody will benefit from it. So I come up with this improved test task where we had a group code review at the end. So I not just told that you're okay, you're not okay. We went through their code and I showed them why this solution is probably not very good and how. And then I told them how it can be solved differently. So I told them, I showed them some patterns and how to use them, and then they had a refactoring and peer code review for them. Then the idea was, then I come up with the idea that they are gonna, they should work on the products for me. And I realized that they can actually write a platform for internship automation for me. And I started 3 parallel projects, and another one was open source project, which another guy was leading. And right now I realized that it is fucking very hard to manage 3 projects in parallel in your free time. And now I'm thinking to modify this kind of stuff in a different way. And I realized that probably the practice in open source project will be very useful for these kind of guys. And I decided to look for open source project owners who are looking for contributors. And if you know somebody, please tell me, because I do have many people for you which are going to help you to develop your open source project. Well, and that's kind of my idea. If you have some feedback, I would be happy to discuss it with you. So this whole thing is in progress and evolving. If you're interested, yeah, you can ask anything. Thank you.